Hi everyone. So this is a special session. It's a Q&A session with Josh. This is part of our weekly series on psychology, and this gives us the chance to kind of have a more informal session with Josh and just go straight and ask him our questions. First of all, Josh, do you have any opening thoughts or where you are, how you see things, maybe an update on kind of our thinking process and all that?
Nothing's coming to mind in particular. I mean, I have to say I really enjoyed the romance in lockdown event earlier this week. That's definitely sort of stuck in my head a bit. Some of the things from that. It's fun to be in the audience of that. That was a good laugh. I think I'm noticing in people that there's a lot more resistance now. We're heading into this second batch of lockdown. Just sort of anecdotal evidence from speaking to people and clients and stuff that people are beginning to get fed up, twitchy. The novelty has more than worn off now. And I'm also noticing that people are getting very angry with the police and things like that. Like that event on Westminster Bridge with Crest of the Dick was just outrageous. And I'm just sort of seeing more and more sort of just general resistance. People are being a little bit more flippant in the supermarkets. I'm noticing just the social distancing is breaking down a tiny bit. And I'm sure I'm not alone in noticing that.
No, I did an experiment because I was planning to go to Greece in early May. Turns out I can't because the flights are not there yet. But when I go to Greece, I have to stay in quarantine and somewhere which is not going to be my home because I'll go to a friend's empty like Airbnb. And I have to stay in quarantine for 15 days. So I made an experiment and I stayed in quote quarantine in my home for 14 days without leaving the house. So I left the house first time this week after 2 weeks, and it was completely different from 2 weeks earlier. Although the weather was almost the same, so it can't be just the weather, way more people outside, the police running up and down trying to get people moving, and the vibe was different. Like it wasn't anymore the zombie apocalypse movie vibe. The vibe was completely different. So it was interesting kind of seeing it in the course of 2 weeks. Yeah. Right. So, and that kind of gets to my first question. So in two of the three previous events, there was a lot of talk about, and you mentioned how to avoid catastrophizing.
Yeah.
So how to avoid going to the worst case scenario, and then and how this is counterproductive. How about though finding ourselves, which is quite often in times of crisis, we find people have ups and downs. So you find yourself happy, enthusiastic, and then kind of on a low where everything's. So there is a danger in catastrophizing. How about, is there a danger of euphoria? So taking this piece of information and having an optimism that might not necessarily lead to reckless behavior, because I don't think anyone's going to do anything stupid. But is there a danger of suddenly putting our hopes up about, maybe things are not that bad and maybe soon life will be closer to normal, and then this will lead to an even worse kind of low?
The main issue with catastrophizing is a lack of evidence. And that's whenever you break down people who are catastrophizing, you see that they miss out certain chains, and then they don't have enough evidence to back up their claim. And I think you would have exactly the same response with euphoria as well. Is it based on evidence, or is it just based on wishful thinking or disconnected? So is it some kind of euphoria that's based in psychosis, as in psychosis meaning not connected to reality? So you have to, the thing about catastrophizing is it's not necessarily, it's okay to start catastrophizing if you allow yourself to look at all the other options too. So one technique that you can often do with people is you can ask them you can encourage them, okay, really fully catastrophize here. Get really into it. Allow yourself to sort of get that out of your system. And then ask yourself, what's the very worst case scenario? And then you ask yourself, what's the most likely scenario? And plan for the most likely. And because you've allowed yourself to catastrophize as well, it often makes it easier to go there. So catastrophizing in itself isn't always terrible, as long as it's in a certain context of a process. But most people, when they're catastrophizing, you know, oh my God, everything's going to end. Oh my God. It's like, well, what evidence do you have? Oh, I just feel it, or something like that. And the same would be equally damaging, I think, for a euphoric position of, you know, how do you, oh, I just feel it. You know, if it was coming from a very sort of emotionalist angle, that's where the real danger is. But it's amazing how whenever you do any kind of experiments is the wrong word, any pieces of work with clients or groups of people, and you break it down and you go through and you the more evidence you feed in, the lower the catastrophizing comes down. I mean, for example, I had a mini catastrophize today. I read some headline that said Australia thinking of locking down for a year, and I immediately went in my head to, I can't stay in my house for a year. You know, and then when I read the article, or skim read it, it was actually saying nothing of the sort. It was kind of saying that they might have to practice some kind of social distancing for a year until vaccine is in place. But my head immediately just went to, and I had to recognize that I did a classic mistake last night where I fell asleep at 8:30 for an hour, woke up at 9:30, and then couldn't get to sleep for ages. So I woke up this morning sleep deprived compared to normal, because I always wake up at the same time. And that is one of the biggest villains around poor catastrophic thinking, etc., is just being really tired. And so I had to, I was like, oh, hold on a sec, you're really tired. This is what happens when you're tired, and so on. And I would just watch out for all of those things. But I think it's a good question. And I would say, to come back to how I initially answered it, it all depends on whether it's linked to evidence or not. And that's the thing about optimism and what's known as learned optimism, is it always has to be rooted in evidence. Otherwise, it's known as naive optimism. If it's just a kind of, oh yeah, I think everything's going to be fine. Why do you think everything's going to be fine? Well, I just kind of do. That doesn't cut it. But if it's like, yeah, I think it's going to be good because I read this report today and I read that report today and this evidence is coming out. And if you clearly look at this, the curve is flat, and whatever it is that you're looking at that's providing, as you said earlier when we were discussing before we officially started, about how the confirmation bias can start to go away once you're just getting enough evidence. And I would say exactly, you know, euphoria or mania, as you can see it in some people, is mania is sort of defined as being disconnected from reality. And so, yeah, it can be equally damaging in that kind of context, definitely.
Thank you. So I have more questions, but Eamon has a question.
So I'm interested in this idea of, I guess, is connected to catastrophizing.
Yeah.
And I'm always interested in sort of, is a previous talk you gave, you talked about how anxiety can be a useful emotion. And it may signal that maybe you're putting off something, maybe you're procrastinating, there's something you're supposed to do, there's something that's like in the back of your mind worrying you. And now I basically take it as a signal that, of that. So in the beginning of the lockdown, I felt anxiety. And I think it was because, you know, all my plans were falling apart.
Yeah.
All these social plans in particular. And once I lined up all these like social plans, things got a lot better. And I think is that I'm trying to make a connection between that and the idea of really thinking through your worst case scenario. So you're saying, okay, this is the worst case scenario, and what can I do to mitigate those things? What can I, is there an easy solution to those things? Is that is there like is that a connection between those two things? Is a systematic way of dealing with that anxiety feeling?
Yeah, I think so. I think when you bring reason to bear, as Gina, that was the expression that I just couldn't remember the other day. When you bring reason to bear on the situation, you allow yourself to go in and really see it for what it is. I think that it's a bit like when you the problem with anxiety is, anxiety is a type of fear, and it's a fear where there are just too many unknowns. So what distinguishes anxiety from, let's say that you really flunked a test and you're fearful of the consequences of that. You're not necessarily feeling anxiety because you flunked it, and it's like, okay, I'm gonna get an E, and that means I'm not going to get into the university, etc. But as soon as it's like, and then you get all these uncertainties, it turns to anxiety. Is when it's like, well, what am I going to do then? And what am I going to do then? And what am I going to do then? And you sort of lose a bit of control over the thinking. And or just anxiety is just when you just have no idea what's going to happen. Whereas, you can be fearful of a situation and it's very clear what's going to happen. And when fear goes away, for example, apparently when people know they're going to die and there's nothing they can do about it, apparently a lot of the time anxiety and fear just go away and it turns to a form of acceptance. And I think that comes from grasping the situation for what it is. And I think what you're saying is, you felt a lot of anxiety. Correct me if I got this wrong, but I think you were saying that when I looked at, when I really went in and I was anxious, and then I looked at what the actual situation is, and by bringing sort of order to my thinking around that, and observing it and everything, my anxiety dissipated. Is that what you were saying happened?
I think I would say that probably in a general way, yes, but in very specifically, it was not basic. You could see as the lockdown came, the sort of my future, and I'm thinking of future in terms of my next week, my week afterwards, was completely unclear. And there was certain things I was looking forward to, and that were, for my psychological well-being, were making me enjoy life. So, what I was going to do, the people I was gonna meet, the people I was gonna spend time with, and then also, in terms of, where am I gonna get my food, how am I gonna do all those things.
Yeah.
But once those things fell into place, when I could get back into some kind of routine and start enjoying things again, that fear went away, or that anxiety went away.
And I think what happens to a lot of people, I've seen this, and it happened to me as well, and other people, is whereas the anxiety, like you reported, I was like, what's it going to be like for getting food? Is it going to be a nightmare? All these sorts of things. Am I going to be able to function and work how I need to work, etc. And once those things, it became clear that, yeah, it's going to be fine going to Tesco's, and it's just going to take a little bit longer, etc. And there's going to be loo roll, and there's going to be all these sorts of things. An acceptance of the situation starts to come in. And I think that it's always when there's an acceptance of what's going on is when anxiety definitely starts to drop. So it's like, I noticed in myself that when I realized there's just so many things I can't plan for, mitigate for, it's just going to happen. I'm completely powerless here. There's very little I can do. I found that my anxiety and fear levels started to drop. Now, what I think is happening to a lot of people now is it's moving to anger. It's moving to anger of, hey, we were like, okay, I kind of get why you had to do this. Yeah, maybe you completely ballsed it up earlier, but now we have to do this because if we don't do this, the health system is going to be completely overrun, and if the health system is completely overrun, so many more people are going to die. And that what people are saying is, I don't want to be one of those people who turns up at the hospital and I have to sort of die in a corridor because there's no beds, etc. And that was making people very nervous, and that's not the situation now. So that's why people are getting angry. But I think, to go back to what you're saying, is I think when you just really allow yourself to study the situation and not sort of walk around or run around like a headless chicken, just solely in the emotion, the emotional reaction to the changes, because the thinking changes. And this is what we have to keep coming back to, is that in most situations, unless there's some kind of extreme trauma or some kind of chemical imbalance, your emotional world always follows, the emotion always follows the thinking. And I think that's what we see time and time again, is that if you allow yourself to think about the situation and go into it, it becomes easier. And that's what it sounded like you were doing.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So definitely the specific techniques I've learned were things like just thinking through the different range of, and instead of thinking like the worst case scenario, I just think of like, and I do sometimes think of worst case scenarios. I would say, okay, if all, how am I going to live in this? How am I going to cope with this sort of situation? And seeing that I can actually cope quite easily, that made things, and I would say, things, instead of feeling fear, I felt anger of that the situation has been placed on me, but it's sort of a righteous anger rather than a helpless fear.
So we have a question from one of our friends in the chat. So Josh, how best to be optimistic, please, is the question. Optimistic means looking at other possibilities. It's not 100% clear to me what possibility means, if our friend wants to elaborate, but let's start with the first part of the question. So, okay, we want to be optimistic, but how can one be optimistic?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's a question I don't want to go into too much, because it is potentially something that we might be looking at in much more detail in a further episode, if you want to call it an episode. But optimism nowadays is really all about the way you think about events, and whether you believe you have agency or not. So for a long time, optimism was considered just something that it used to be called, it's now referred to in psychology as dispositional optimism. It was just the way you were disposed. One was just happy-go-lucky, believe that the glass was always half full, and that's just the way you were, and there's nothing and take it or leave it. And some people are just not like that, and that's the way they're born. And this has been shown to be complete nonsense. So to answer your question, I would really look at Martin Seligman's learned optimism work. But as you say, optimistic means looking at other possibilities. Yeah, it does. It means considering all the various options without falling into any of the classic thinking traps. So allowing yourself to put yourself in someone else's shoes. It also involves, like, it could be this, it could be this, it could be this, it could be this, and it could be this. And how would I look at all of those? And it also, being optimistic requires an ability to be able to dispute certain types of thinking. So in a way, to be able to just get involved in the thinking and look at things from all angles. And that is really ultimately the ultimate difference between an optimist and a pessimist, is that if a bad event happens, a pessimist believes that event is permanent, as in it will never change. It means it's pervasive. So that one bad event is pervasive, will be pervasive in every aspect of your life. And that the blame rests solely with self. I'm talking about a bad event. And an optimist would say that this event is temporary. It's only unique to that event, and so on. It's a different, what they call it, a different kind of explanatory style. So it's how you explain how things happen. And so if you want to be more optimistic, you need to start challenging your negative belief sets. And you need to challenge your belief sets and start to be able to look at things in a different way. But I would really push you towards looking at learned optimism. Some of the interesting research with optimism, and I know I've said this quite a few times, is that if you divide the population up into four fourths, between pessimists and optimists. So you've got pessimists, semi-pessimists, semi-optimists, and optimists. Optimists tend to live about 20 years longer on average, which is no laugh. Is a pretty significant difference in and that's mostly tied to heart disease and stress on the nervous system. But I think that's the best thing to say so far, because as I said, I think we're going to be doing a whole feature on optimism relatively soon. So I don't want to go too much into that.
Okay, we have a question which is exactly what I was about to ask. So if I'm allowed, I want to elaborate. No, actually, let's answer that question of our friend, and then I'll go to my question. So the question is it rational to completely avoid the news?
I would say it's not rational to completely avoid the news, but I think it's rational to choose when it's most appropriate for you to look at the news. For example, I sometimes get sucked into the news and Twitter too late at night, and I don't sleep as well. My mind is gone. And also I'd say, what news? I think it's rational to avoid, I don't know what he's not around anymore, is he? But, if you were saying I'm watching a lot of Alex Jones or something like that, then I would say it would be rational to avoid that kind of news. I think the context there is are we talking about fake news? Are we talking, all sorts of things here. Which news are you talking about? For example, like I would say it's more rational to avoid the Guardian than it is to, but then again, I would say it's rational to avoid the Mail as well. So, you have to choose your sources, and I would say you need to choose the time of day. So I at the moment, what I do is I don't check the news till 9 a.m. So I get up at about 6:37, and I deliberately use that time to do some meditation, some journaling, and other forms of work that I need to do that require like full focus. And then I will check the news. It depends what you're checking the news for as well, because it's very easy to get quite adrenalized by the news. And am I using the news just to change the way I feel, or am I actually using the news to find out factual information? And I think you have to ask yourself that as well, because the news can be also like quite a distraction technique. It's very easy to suddenly open up a whole load of tabs and get yourself lost in all sorts of things. And am I using it as an avoidance? You have to ask yourself, am I using the news right now to avoid what I really need to be doing? Because I can always tell myself that the news is very important and it's okay for me to look at it. So I think I think we have to be careful with it. And I would say it's irrational to completely avoid the news, because then you might not come out of lockdown. Lockdown might be over and you're just, you're just stuck in your flat, missing out on taking advantage of the new era, whatever. I even says maybe avoid highly political news. Yeah. I'm finding it's more rational for me to actually check 3 or 4 people who seem to be pretty sane on Twitter at the moment. There's a couple of professors and stuff that I'm finding pretty useful. And then checking, like, for example, I will check the Sun site for getting they seem to get the numbers in the quickest if I'm interested. And so on. There's certain sites and things that I find helpful, but I do think it's quite, you don't need to. I was listening to this, I was involved in a talk the other day on this course that I'm doing, and the lead professor running it was saying that actually they don't need to check the news that much because it always filters through anyway. The important stuff in their world always filters through. So they said they check the news much less often than they used to, and they say that they still seem to know as many of the essentials as they did when they were checking it all the time.
Can I try to make the moral case for avoiding the news? So I tried it for myself for 5 days, and the rationale was the following: that A, in the next 5 days, there's no chance I'm going out because I was training myself for the Greek quarantine. B, we see from experience that these days there are no news. Like the Stanford test that I was anticipating was was happening, so we knew there would be no results for 2 weeks. And basically, the only news every day were number of deaths, and basically that was it. So, is it an evasion if you then say, "Look, I'm going in these days, and there's nothing that can have an effect on my career or something." So why not say, "Look, there's nothing. I have zero control on the situation of what's happening out there. So how about for these specific days, I will just focus on the in here. I will, let's say, retreat." And you could say the bad thing is this is a form of evasion, but the good things is that in this way you're more productive and you're more sane. So kind of throwing a bit of objectives there. Could we say that this kind of voluntary evasion and conscious evasion, which is not like evasion like the virus doesn't exist, but it's evasion that I don't want to know the latest figures because they mean nothing to me. So like I can do nothing about that. So it's not really an evasion. Could we say that this is healthy? Or is this just a cheap option to try and feel better?
No, I think you're right in that. Like something that I've done recently is I've actually switched off all notifications on my phone from every single app, except the phone app, the actual phone part. I've switched off, and that includes like so I don't get some weird thing on Facebook telling me this, or I don't get a little Twitter update or just completely, I get nothing now, absolutely nothing. And what that means is I can now check when I want to check things, and I'm not getting interrupted. Because I think it was McKinsey did this study on interruption in work, and they say on average, the average worker is interrupted about 6 times in an office, interrupted 6 times an hour, and it takes about 5 minutes each time to get back into focus. So that's half an hour out of every hour lost in interruption. So I think one of the things to do is we are terrible at multitasking. It's almost impossible to do. So allowing yourself to unitask, and I think I was talking about this a bit last week, is otherwise you have what we call, cognitive overload and cognitive residue when you're trying to do lots of different tasks and you don't complete them, and you start. So you're trying to write your essay, or you're trying to write your proposal, and ping up from Twitter, it gives you the death count, and then you start thinking about the death count when you're trying to write the conclusion to or write the abstract for your paper or whatever it is. Destroys productivity. So I think it's actually it's really important to be able to delegate what times, or what, maybe at lunchtime you'll check the news, or you'll check the news at 6 or at 9, and whatever it is, and so that you can use the rest of the other time to be productive and in focus on the work you want to do. Because it's very easy to be distracted by an Instagram post, and then a message from a loved one, and then an email. I mean, this is even emails. Like I now don't have the email. I used to have my email program on permanently in the background, and when something would come through, I'd be like, "Oh, I'll just check it." And I think the same thing with news. Exactly. Like now that when I check things when I need to and want to check, like I go into my WhatsApp at lunchtime or something, and there's all the messages. It's like, right, I've set this time aside to respond to those messages now. Instead of doing one thing, a message comes through, I start responding to that, then I get back to what I was doing, and so on. And oh, look, there's an announcement from Sky News about the Prime Minister is going to talk about this, and blah, blah, blah. And all these things just take up all my working memory as well, and make it very hard for me to be productive. And I think in that context, what you're saying, Nikos, I think it's really important to, I wouldn't call it evasive. I'd say selective of when I want to do that. And ask yourself, how much value is it to me in news? What is it investing, and so on. You know, if it's like I'm following the international news because I want to know when I can get on a flight because it's really important for me to get on a flight to do this, then in that context, maybe it's much more important to keep checking it than if, you know, we're locked down for another 3 weeks. There's not really much I can do about that. So I'll just keep my ear to the ground about what's going on, but use this time really productively to write my book or whatever it is.
Have you read, by the way, the book Deep Work? Because what you say sounds a bit like the thesis of the author.
Deep Work by?
I can't remember, but I'll tell you in a second. That's by...
Because I definitely haven't read the book.
Cal Newport.
But one of the courses that I've done that references a lot of these people, that book was mentioned as one of the references within the course they've done.
Yeah, it was good. And the reason I did this also in Twitter is because I noticed a weird phenomenon. I was almost getting a dopamine hit that the last time I remember myself getting this was when I was like 15 and I was kind of obsessed with video games. So I would go to I would have at least with the 10 people on Twitter that would be like the optimist guys. So I would go there every 20 minutes to get an optimist kind of hit.
Yeah.
Which almost was more as unproductive as watching the list of the dead people or whatever, because there was no point. It's not that, as you said, if I get good news, I might catch that flight to go back home. I was like, yeah, tell me that this is working. Tell me that, you know, the fear mongers are wrong. And although it almost became this tribalist thing, like it's the one side we're the optimists and we have to stick it to the other side, and no matter what data come out, I'm never gonna agree that the lockdown people are right.
What you're saying actually ties into what Ella's asking on the chat. Is any advice on how to be more productive when working from home? Well, to be more productive in anything you do, one of the things you want to do is you want to get into a flow state. And to get into a flow state is an optimal form of consciousness where you're performing at your best, you feel your best, learning is accelerated, you're fully focused on the task, and so on. To get into a flow state, there is always the struggle phase. And the struggle phase is when you enter into the task at hand and you know that the challenge is going to push you, and during the struggle phase, either you give up or you push through the struggle phase, and then you can enter into this flow state. And I've summed it up quite quickly there, but what's really important there is that the flow state that follows, the struggle phase, when you do pretty much anything, this is the same like if you go for a run, the first sort of 15 minutes is what we describe the struggle phase. And usually it's the first 15 minutes you're like, do I really want to be doing this? Shall I turn home? Oh, I think my ankle hurts. I'm not fit enough for this, all this sort of thing. And then you break through. And this is what so many people report, is you break through the struggle phase. And this is what happens when you're often playing a sport or you're playing an instrument or anything. There is often this struggle phase to begin with. And one of the things that keeps happening is people use their phones, they use the little dopamine hits that they get from Twitter or from Instagram, etc., to soothe that struggle phase. And and then what happens is you find yourself in a continual struggle phase all day without ever allowing yourself to get into flow or getting into full focus on the task ahead. So one piece of advice that I'd say to Ella here is, be aware that struggle phase to begin with when you're trying to be productive is an essential and a necessary part of getting into full productivity. And if you don't go through that struggle phase, it just ain't going to happen. So one of the things you need is not to be interrupted. So you don't want to be interrupted by other people, and you don't want to be interrupted kind of by yourself or by your phone. So a lot of people will put their phone away when you're really trying to be productive. Switch your email programs off when you're trying to be productive, and so on. There's all sorts of small tips that you can do that. You know, you can make, one of the ways of being productive is to have your desk as tidy as possible, so there's less distraction, and so on. There's many things. Are you hydrated? Have you had enough sleep, etc. But I think just as a principle is just to really understand, and this would really, interesting to me is I would notice that I would be involved in something and I think, oh, I'll just have a quick look at that, or I'll just have a quick check of this, and you get the little dopamine hit, and then you're back to square one. You never break through into what we call as the release phase from struggle, and then into flow, where you're fully in the zone, and productivity goes through the roof. And you need to go through that struggle phase, and phones are lethal for that.
For those of us who don't know French, what does that mean, aiming? Mise en place? No.
So mise en place is just in French. It just means like put in its place.
Yeah.
Put in place. So in cooking, which I don't do much of, it means to have all your tools, ingredients, and everything set up.
Yeah, and that's absolutely fits into exactly what I'm saying. That when you have everything set up, that requires a certain kind of effort, or a certain kind of, it's like, oh, I have to be meticulous here. I have to set out all my tools. And sometimes that can be a little bit like irritating or boring because it's not as fun, but it's part of the struggle phase. And then once you've got everything there, boom, you can start working really hard and fast. But yeah, you want to have your areas of productivity really set up, so you know exactly where everything is all the time. So you want to reduce as much cognitive load as possible that's outside of the actual work that you want to be doing. So you want to always like have a phone charger that's always there. So you don't want to get up and open a drawer and find a new charger and go back upstairs, etc. All these kind of things reduce the cognitive load so that you can always focus on the task at hand. And that's essential for productivity, or peak. A lot of the work I do is peak performance work. And if you don't have that in place, if you think about, if you don't have everything set up, so that you want to have everything set up so you don't have to think about it. That's really the principle. So you need to have your glass of water there. You need to have your notepad there. All these kind of things laid out and always ready so that you don't actually ever have to wonder where things are, so that you can always remain focused on the task in hand.
So we have another question in the chat. By the way, when I read a question from the chat, I'm not reading the names because I assume some people might want to ask a question from the chat because they don't want to go on live or whatever. So that's why I'm not mentioning names in the chat. So one of our friends asked, are we using dope hit as distraction?
I presume you mean, are we using like dopamine hits as distraction? Are we using is?
Yeah, the dopamine hits.
Yeah. Well, not all of us are, but many of us fall into that trap, and we tend to fall into that trap when we're struggling. We want a little feel good, like, oh, little boost, little boost, little boost. The thing about dopamine is a lot of these neurotransmitters is they're really useful and really destructive sometimes. So dopamine is an essential chemical or neurotransmitter for increasing the ability to see connections. And that's really important. But also we could use that like stimulation to take us away from, the, as I said, the task in hand. So a lot of the time we are using dopamine, little micro dopamine hits as distractions. But then again, you know, like as Jordan Peterson would say, you know, make your bed. Well, one of the reasons that we make the bed in the morning is, one, to create order so that we're less distracted. You know, a tidy room is less distracting on the eyes, so you can focus on what you need to do. But also, when you make the bed, you get a little dopamine hit. It feels good. It's just like, oh, that's cool. And, you know, it gives you a little lift. So sometimes it's really a good thing to do. And sometimes it's, but the thing is, when I'm making the bed, it's not, I haven't sat down at the desk ready to tackle the day or tackle the task at hand. You know, it's part of a process, as a prior process. So it fits in well with, you know, getting up in the morning, putting some order in the day and starting. Whereas if I'm trying to write my essay and then I keep getting these little dopamine hits from my phone, that's not very productive. So yes, we can be guilty of using as a distraction, but we can also use it as an essential tool in generating connections, connectivity with other people, etc. So dopamine is a good and a bad thing depending on the context.
So Josh, when you talked about the flow state and the struggle phase,
Yeah.
with horror, I realized that there's a good chance that 99.9% of my day and work is the struggle phase. So I have two questions. A, how do you know you're in the flow state? And B, for a normal person who sits down to work, what's the duration, let's say, of the struggle phase? Okay, opposite order. What's usually the duration of the struggle phase, and how do you know that you're actually in the flow phase?
Can people see that screen?
Yes.
Yeah, so here's the struggle phase. When you are in the struggle phase, you've got a lot of cortisol and norepinephrine firing through your system. And I think everybody knows what they feel like. So cortisol is the stress hormone, and there is a very distinct physiological side of stress that you feel, you know, that tension, and you can feel the stress sort of in your blood, you know. And norepinephrine is like adrenaline, so you feel that kind of anxiety, etc. So that's what you're feeling in the struggle phase. Yeah. And also your brainwave state is you're in a beta brainwave state, which is kind of what we're probably in right now, and it's when you're talking to people, etc. It's quite an excitable state. When you move from the struggle phase, you move into the release phase, and you go into an alpha brainwave state. An alpha brainwave state is that kind of state when you first get up in the morning. It's you're awake, but you're not fully kind of. It is a distinctive state. You know, you're awake, but it's different to sort of normal day to day. And then when you get into the flow state, you're in a theta gamma brainwave states, and they are. When you're in flow, you're fully at one with what you're doing. You don't really notice the passage of time. It's what we call effortless effort. So it feels very different to being in struggle or even in the release phase, because it when you are in flow, there's a lot of dopamine and a lot of endorphins are released, and also this other chemical is released called anandamide. And the closest chemical to anandamide is THC, which is found in weed. And when anandamide is released, when you're in the flow state, everything is a bit more sparkly. Everything is a little bit brighter. Everything is a little bit kind of, your senses are a little bit more heightened. And so they feel very different. When you're in flow, you really know it. And one of the most interesting things about flow states, is when you're in flow at work, and when you're in flow climbing, and when you're in flow surfing, and when you're in flow skiing, when you're in flow painting a picture or playing a musical instrument, or, you know, another way of describing flow is being in the zone. When you're just completely in the zone. The really interesting about flow is it feels the same. It's not like there's a flow state that feels a special kind of flow involved in writing that is a different sensation to when you're skiing or whatever. Being in flow feels pretty much the same no matter what task or activity you're doing. And so you start to learn, when you have this awareness, you start to learn, and you start to learn and notice the physiological aspects of it. And it's like, hey, yeah, I'm in flow now. You definitely know what it's like to be in struggle. You know what it's like to feel like when you're really stressed. What's very interesting, when you go through the release phase and you go into this alpha brainwave state, a lot of nitric oxide is released. And nitric oxide has two functions. It flushes out cortisol, and it also opens up all the blood cells, not blood cells, all the alveoli, etc. It allows you to uptake more oxygen. So that's why, for example, if those of you who go running, when you break through that struggle barrier, often you go up a level in your running. And it's because of the flood of nitric oxide is allowing you to, your productivity of your respiratory system goes right up. And so they feel very different, these phases of the flow cycle. And so the struggle phase really does feel very stressed. And when you're in flow, you feel very free. You feel very open. And there's a reason why we call it effortless effort. because it just feel you're just totally in the zone. And time dilation is one of the main features of being in flow. You just don't notice the passage of time.
One of the questions would be to find out how to get on flow. Would you say that the Csikszentmihalyi guy is is it a good source to start from, his book?
Fantastic source.
For the layman, I mean, not for the psychologist, for someone who...
Yeah, absolutely. It's written for the layman. But then I would move into the work of Stephen Kotler, and Martin Seligman writes about it as well. Actually, Aristotle was, you know, they often talk about eudaimonia as being more of the flow, being in the flow state. That form of happiness as being in action, as something you're doing, as opposed to being an emotional pleasurable state. More right. The hedonic side of happiness is the positive emotion side, and the flow side of happiness and flourishing is the being, the doing side of you know, how do you pronounce it? I say eudaimonia now.
Oh, in Greek it's evdaimonia.
Okay, interesting.
Now, I might be looking too much into this flow thing, but what I've noticed, and I remember it now that you mentioned the dioxide. So when I do, sometimes with my training buddies, we do 10 sets of 10 burpees supersetted with jumping rope. The first 2 or 3 sets are very, very difficult. So, but you see the weird phenomenon that set number 6 and number 7, at some point you lose count of the sets.
Yeah.
But while you expect that it's gonna become more and more and more difficult, around set 7, 8, it's actually easier. Has it got anything to do with this?
It's exactly got some. It's exactly you're describing getting into flow within the exercise process. So I noticed, like, I've been exercising. I haven't been meeting my personal trainer in lockdown, but I've actually been meeting a couple of people in the park, and we're socially distancing, doing sessions together. And it's always the same. The first 10, 15 minutes is difficult. And we always start off with skipping and stuff, and it's quite horrible, and your heart rate. And then, boom, you're suddenly coming to the end of the session.
Right.
It's exactly that. And it's partly to do with the physiological side of what's going on in the body, but it's also due to the focus that you get into, etc.
Now, since this is a Q&A and we can ask basically whatever,
yeah,
could you tell us what is your, or maybe not yours, but someone's that you consider an ideal day of productivity? So from the moment you wake up till the moment you go to bed, how would that look like? So let's say you have a lot of work and you have serious work. So it's not, let's say, a Sunday where you chill. And you want to say tomorrow is going to be the day that I make it really count. How would that day look like?
So that's a really good question. There's a lot of good work around that. So what you would do if tomorrow was like, I've really got to get on it tomorrow and just be fully focused. If you have regular sleep, stick to that regular sleep pattern. Don't try and change the sleep pattern. Get up when you normally get up. Get 8 hours sleep. Before you go to bed, put everything out that you need to do then. I mean, there's a lot of people in Silicon Valley who say, I only wear black clothes. The reason I only wear black clothes is then I don't have to think about what I'm doing in the morning. I just put the exact clothes on, and then I haven't used up a certain amount of cognitive energy on choosing my clothes. The same thing with your breakfast, the same thing with your coffee or whatever it is. Get up and do, maybe a lot of guys who are super productive will get up and they will do their 20 minutes meditation. And they might do their other ritual as well of writing their gratitude list or something like that. And then make sure that the phone is off, or you're getting no notifications. Often a lot of people who are super productive will go straight from almost getting up into work. When you get up it's a flow hack. When you get up in the morning, you're very much in an alpha brainwave state. When you're in alpha, you almost miss out the struggle phase. And it can be a bit of a hack to miss out the struggle phase and get straight into work that way. And whenever you stop for work, for your breaks, make sure that whatever you do in that break is less stimulating than the work that you're doing. So, for example, if you're writing your I keep coming back to this at the moment. It's very much on my mind. I've got to write a paper at the moment. So you've got to write your paper, yeah, and you're in the zone with it, and it's going well, and that's it, 2 hour blocks. You can be in flow for about 2 hours. Then you need to. One of the downsides of flow is that it requires a huge amount of energy. So you burn out on it. So you need to rest, take a break, maybe eat something, etc. But let's say you're working on your paper, you've done a solid 2 hours, you need to have a break. In that break, maybe you're just going to do a little bit of breathing, have some nuts, have a drink, something like that. Don't call your mother, or don't try and call the bank or anything like that that's going to overstimulate you and take you out of that focus. Always do something that's going to bring you down as opposed to up in the break. And then allow yourself, a lot of these Silicon Valley guys get up at about 4:30 in the morning. They're working from 5:30 in 2 hour slots, but it's like a 4 hour block, but with 2 hours and a mini break and then another 2 hours. And they will work those sort of 4 hours solid. And then it's like 9:30 in the morning. And then they might be like, okay, I'll have some breakfast or whatever it is. And then get back, refuel and then get back on it. But they will have done most of the work in that first 4 hours of the day of non-interruption. One of the main reasons that the CEOs get up so early, it's got nothing to do with actually getting up early. It's got to do with distraction. That often these guys who go into the office super early, the reason that they do so well is at that time, for those 2-3 hours, they're not being disturbed. And then they can use the rest of the day delegating. Because really a top CEO is all about delegation and making sure that everything's in place. But they've also got to come up with the strategizing and the great ideas that take the company forward. So they need to be ready to delegate when the whole team is there. But they also need that time when they're fully focused. And you can only do that on your own. There is a space for, what do they call it? When you write mood boards and you do all that kind of stuff in a team and you get ideas and bounce things around. But ultimately, you need that time to, only you can integrate your own ideas. Only you can bring those things together, and you need that time to do that. So, yeah, I like what someone in the chat has said. That's a great tip. Thank you. Do something less stimulating in your break. I violate this all the time on non-productive days. Yeah. Also, just to be super productive, I'm going to look up something else as well, actually, because it was such a good question. It's got me thinking. I have got it. Okay, there's something I've got somewhere. The overloaded executive protocol. This is something that you would advise someone if they were, one of those people say, I've got no time to do anything, but I really need to make some change, which is slightly different to what you asked about how to be super focused and in flow, but there's some quite good techniques here. So the first thing is really identify. So if you really want to be super productive, you've got to have your goals worked out, your SMART goals worked out. So again, the night before is a good time to identify your SMART goals. So SMART stands for specific, measurable, actionable, realistic, and time framed. But so if tomorrow needs to be a super productive day, make sure you know what it is exactly that you need to get done that day, because that will be the purpose of the day. 5 minutes gratitude. A gratitude list provides a lot of positive emotion, makes you feel good. When you feel good, you're much more able to make connections. You're much more creative. So gratitude is a great way of driving creativity. 5 minutes deep balanced breathing. One of the reasons for doing that is it brings the prefrontal cortex more online. When the prefrontal cortex is more online, you're more rational.
Does box breathing count for this?
No, but box breathing is yeah. If you did box breathing and you only did 4 or 5 seconds and stayed on that, then yes.
All right, thank you.
It's the balanced breathing aspect of it is really important, because the balanced breathing is what balances your nervous system. If you're doing proper box breathing and going up by a second each time you go around the box, you're actually going to be overstimulating your sympathetic nervous system and stressing yourself out. And then 10 minutes of primary flow activity. And that's more, you're not getting into flow, but you're connecting to the good feelings that you associate with the flow states that do the most for you. So, for example, you might love playing the guitar and you really get into flow playing the guitar. Well, either you bring out a guitar and just play it for 10 minutes, or watch some clips of some of your favorite guitarists, etc. But allow yourself to get kind of excited from the things that you really value. And that would be like what you would teach if Steve Jobs came and said, look, I'm so busy, but I really still I'm overloaded and I want to just implement a few things into my day. You would be able to get away with this. There is another protocol that you could do for someone, the ideal protocol, but that a lot of these guys would just be like, you got to be joking, I've got no time. I haven't got enough time to go to the loo, let alone implement any of these things. You know, you try and tell Tim Cook to do half an hour's meditative breathing, and he'll probably fire you. So you have to be smart with it. But these are some of the things that you would implement to get yourself going when you want to get into a productive space.
Right. I have to say this. I know I say this every time, so people will think I'm lying, but this is really valuable. So thank you so much for that. I'm taking a lot of value out of this. So another question from the chat. What do you think will be the most difficult part of getting back to normal when this is all over? And can I ask, when you say it's all over, do you mean the lockdown? Or let's take both situations. So at some point, maybe in 3 weeks, maybe in 4 weeks, we're going to say, okay, this thing is still out there. You need to go out to the world. So what will be the challenges then? Because I assume this is what the question means. But if our friend means when the whole thing is over, let us clarify. But what about in 3-4 weeks when we're going to be told, okay, carefully get back to work? What will be the most difficult part, you think?
It'd be interesting to see what everyone thinks would be with that. But I think one of the most difficult parts is going to be, are we going to just sort of the way we socially interact with people? Are we ever going to shake hands with people again or not? You know, I think that's a sort of serious question. Are we going to hug people? Are we going to know what's appropriate and what's not appropriate in terms of just being with strangers, being with family? Like, I think there's going to be a lot of difficulty around that. And then I think, and so that's kind of more on your day-to-day. And I think one of the most difficult parts of getting back to normal is work. I think it's going to be really I think it really depends on what you're doing. And is it actually going to be normal? I think we're going to have to see like how devastating the economic impact is going to be of all of this. And also, I think that people are going to be very exhausted from this, much more exhausted than they make out. And there's going to be a lot of pressure to bounce back straight away without really realizing that, hey, this is, a lot of people have been quite sledgehammered by all of this. And I think a lot of people are going to have to, will find that maybe they overdo it and become quite ill or depressed or etc. I think there's going to be quite a bit of a struggle for people to get back into it as well. So I think there's a lot of things.
So someone in the chat mentions the coming economic depression. Yeah, but I mean, even part of the question, I guess, is even if this was not the case, the mere fact that we've been locked and there's this awkwardness in social interactions is a big thing in itself. By the way, that's a good thing, though, that the depression. Do you think there's a chance that we're going to be so preoccupied with figuring out the economic crisis that at some point within some months, we'll even forget the virus, although the virus will still be there.
I think that there are going to be so many things that we can't. If we take this year, for example, this year was looking pretty cool, pretty busy, pretty excited about things in terms of what I was up to, in terms of work, etc. And then boom, it's like, that's all been ripped away. And I don't know what's going to happen there. And I was, you know, I had to take responsibility for my business, and I had to start thinking about, like, as it was getting more successful, I had to start thinking about, was I going to get a virtual PA? Was I going to invest in certain things? Did I have to get new types of insurance? Did I have to get new types of trainings? All sorts of things that I was, you know, being pretty mature and grown up about and responsible in terms of my business. I did not think there was going to be a global pandemic, and it wasn't something that I prepared for, and did cross my mind, you know. And I think this, you know, it's pretty fair to say that it's not something that any of us really, unless we were working in some form of intelligence, etc., would have known to have prepared for this. And I think there are going to be other things that we will not be aware of and prepared for that are going to happen over this next year. Is going to be really bumpy. I mean, one of the things that, so Christina, my partner, this is something that no one thought was going to happen. Yeah. She's out in Norway. She works in emergency medicine. Everything was geared towards COVID in the hospitals. They're sitting there twiddling their thumbs now. They don't have much to do because they've cancelled all the operations for everything else. And they're now saying that 60,000 people in the UK may die from cancer this year because of the cancelled and pushed back operations. Well, that's something that we weren't preparing for, but it's a consequence of the consequence of the consequence. So I think there's going to be a lot of anxiety. We're going to be seeing a lot of things that none of us really predicted or was even aware of was going to happen across all of our lives, particularly in our work lives. And I think that's going to be make the situation very not normal. And I think it's going to be generating anxiety. I think people are going to be a little bit paranoid. They're going to be a little bit wary. There's going to be all sorts of things going on. And I, you know, as someone says in the chat, a depression would be devastating. Is it going to be a depression? I don't know. You know, there's some of the reports I saw today were going to say, yeah, it's going to be a horror show of a contraction. And then there's going to be this huge expansion, but is it? We don't know. You know, we do know that throwing tons of borrowed money at situations doesn't help things. I did see something the other day that an interesting thing that gave me hope, a small glimmer of hope, but at the same time, is anyone talking about it? When the big crash of 1929 happened, and the Americans went into the Great Depression, and they pushed forward the New Deal, etc. And many people now argue that the New Deal greatly prolonged the Depression. In the UK, they cut taxes to right down, and they rapidly reduced spending, and growth was going up 6% a year. So there are historical precedents of what to do and what not to do in these kind of situations. And it seemed like the UK back then actually did a pretty good job. But it seems like that everybody is saying what we need to do is borrow even more money, print money, and cause some. So I think there's so many factors at play. We don't know what's going to happen there. We still don't even really know why there hasn't been the hyperinflation from all the quantitative easing before, and is that going to catch up, and all sorts of things. So there's so many factors here going on that you could become very catastrophic in your thinking and get very anxious. But I think there's going to be so many different areas that we don't really know what's going to happen. You know, is everyone going to worship the NHS even more now? Is that going to be like, are we going to find that we're going to have continual waves of this virus and more lockdowns? I just don't know.
So one more question on the same theme, and then we go back to a question from earlier, which is on the issue of productivity. So can we actually go back to, quote, normal, or will this have an impact on society for an unseeable amount of time? And a second question, is there any positives that can come out of this?
Well, I think, you know, someone here is asking, like, will my Krav Maga class properly return? You know, I've been thinking something similar about that. Like, I do a lot of calisthenics, and will my calisthenics class come back or not? Are all the gyms and things just going to be our whole industry is going to be completely screwed by this, and are going to really contract and die, or are they going to barely survive? I don't know. But here, can we go back to normal? I don't know. This will have an impact on society for an unseeable amount of time, definitely. Are there any positives that can come out of this? Yeah, I think there are some major positives that will come out of this in terms of technology. I think that people are going to realize that you can work from home much more easily than you thought, that it might be possible to, it might have an impact on things like rush hours and things like that. Also, if you can prove that your productivity has gone up from working at home, and then that's of value to you, and that your work, your companies, etc., can see that that's true, that will have that could potentially have a positive. Now, one thing that heard someone talk about the other day, and I don't know whether it's a positive or a negative, or it's just a change, that some people think that there's going to be a real resurgence of suburbia after this. That people are like, don't want to be fully isolated from other people, but they don't want to be fully jam-packed in the middle in a sardine can as well. And that the outskirts of London are going to become much more valuable. Now, I don't know whether that's a positive or a negative. We'll see. But there's all sorts of ways that I think, particularly with, I'm not sure if there's positives, but I definitely think there are opportunities. I think there are opportunities to finally, maybe, perhaps, start to debate how awful the NHS is in terms of its system. Because there's a lot of people out there, you know, typical news anchors and stuff are going, well, Germany's system seems to be working a bit better than ours. I wonder why. That might be able to be debated. I don't know, because I'm also scared that also people are like, all this clapping for the NHS and everything is so strange that maybe it's going to make it even harder to even contemplate analysing and criticising the NHS for what it is. We'll see.
It's a bit Darwinian, but I've seen it a lot, specifically in the early stages of the crisis, in the like self-development Twitter. Is it horrible for people to think, well, most people are going to spend the quarantine with Netflix and boozing and porn and video games? I'm going to spend the quarantine getting healthier, stronger, more productive. Is this a healthy way of thinking?
Well, I think
not so much the comparison part, but also see it that I'm going to be, let's say, one of the few who are going to come out of this better. Or is this Darwinian and kind of sick?
I don't know. I mean, I think if you use the opportunity to get fit, to learn some new skills, etc., then that's part of your reward for if you are able to capitalize on that. I think maybe health-wise, I think people are going to be washing their hands a lot more. I think maybe that will have a big impact. I mean, I only have to walk around London to see there's a lot of people jogging who have never jogged before in their lives. You can see it in the way they run and how sweaty and everything they are. But maybe in certain quite large swathes of the population, maybe a lot of people are getting a little bit fitter and a bit healthier. I don't know. I think it's too early to tell. But I think there will inevitably be some what might be deemed positives from this and breakthroughs, maybe in medicine, maybe in some of the vaccine processes, etc. We'll see. That's all I can say to that.
So to continue and maybe end on a positive note, and when I say positive, I mean on something that has to do with productivity rather than the virus itself. So one of our friends asks, best to break goals into small bits to avoid fear of overwhelming. So for example, to make this concrete, with your article, for example, is it better to say 1,000 words per day, or does this also in a way limit you? Because I've seen this with my book. I would put words limit, so 500 words per day. And then I would do it, and then for the rest of the day I would procrastinate. And these 500 words were not even that great. So small goals, or think big and then maybe be overwhelmed.
I think what you need to do is it has to be very clear what your overall goal is. Like, I'm going to write the book and I've got the theme and I know what I'm actually going to be writing. I've done all my research, etc. And then it's, I think it depends on the person, but I remember one person saying, I write a page a day. And when I write a page a day, every day, that's a book a year. Yeah. And they say a page a day isn't actually too much. It's not, it doesn't overload the mind when I think about a page a day. When I think about a chapter a week, or I think about a book a year, I become very overwhelmed. Marathon runners break down their runs into the next mile. And so they split the task up into sub-goals and sub-goals and sub-goals. And that, you have to think about how much you can hold in mind. So one's crow or one's working memory. And that's essential. So that's why you do need to keep breaking things down into simpler units, etc., so you can hold it. I'll often say this to, like, I seem to get quite a few artists in practice. Artists seem to be quite tortured souls in some ways, and I'm always having to go, whoa, slow down. You don't even need to be thinking about the exhibition yet. You need to paint the pictures first. So you do always have to keep narrowing things down to what you can handle, because you need to be able to have enough cognitive space to hold the task in hand and have some extra bandwidth to think around it. Does that make sense? So I have to be able to hold in mind the task and have a bit more bandwidth for other options. I can't be completely full up. So breaking your goals into small bits, but if that makes it easier, definitely do it. Because people do become totally overwhelmed with the whole task in hand. So if you need to create an album in the old days of songs, you need to write the songs first. Then once you've written the songs, you start thinking about the track, the order and the artwork and all these sorts of things. But if you start trying to think about the artwork and the promotion and the marketing and the writing of the songs, and forget about it. You've already hit your working memory's full already. And this is why you need to keep writing lists and breaking things down and breaking things down and breaking things down. Because every time you write a list and you get your goals and stuff out onto paper, it's no longer in your working memory taking up bandwidth. And that's essential. This is one of the great crossovers that you're seeing between objectivist thinking around the crow and a lot of goals-based peak performance work that's keeps saying we need to be thinking about things in 5s and 7s at max, etc. And the crow epistemology says we can hold up to 7 things in mind at most, 7 units. And although I'm holding up 5 fingers, I mean 7 units, and at most, but usually it's 5. And if you want to design a course or anything that you want people to be able to do, you need to have those those principles in mind. So yeah, breaking things down is essential. But don't break it down into too many small bits that you then become overwhelmed. So if you break the task down into 20 small bits, you're going to be completely overwhelmed again. So you need to break it down into 5 or whatever it is.
If I've missed any question in the chat, speak now or remain silent till the next event with Josh. So I guess that's it, unless someone has any other question. Again, I have to thank Josh personally, because I think tomorrow is going to hopefully be a particularly productive day, putting into practice the notes that I've kept here. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, Josh. And definitely helpful tips. And also thanks to the audience, because although Josh has all this knowledge, but if the good questions don't kind of tease this knowledge out, this session would not be so useful. So good job also from the part of the people who ask the questions.
I want to show you one thing.
Yes.
This is one of the things I learned about. So I don't know if you can see it, but there's my phone now.
100% charged.
Yeah, but that's all I've got now. No picture of my girlfriend, no picture of any of the apps or Wave or anything. And because I have no notifications now, because I don't have the distraction, I can get the time, get back onto my task, and then say at lunchtime or whatever it is. Or a lot of guys now will say, yeah, I only do my email between 5 and 6 in the day. I have that one time of the day to go through all my emails, and that's what I do.
And
so
something that has helped me with this, I have a separate application which is called Viber. I don't know if it's not very popular in the UK, but I've got all my Greek family in Viber, and Viber is the only app that the notifications are on. So yeah. I'm not worried, am I missing something important from my family in Greece? Because if they need me, they can find me there, or they'll call. So it's not I'm wondering, oh, something bad has happened while all my notifications are closed. So I found balance in this way.
Yeah, you can do that. You can do that as well with your WhatsApp and everything. You can have like key people that come through if you want to. But even that's, you'll actually find that when you start practicing it, even that's not actually that important. Yeah, Viber's a funny one. It's much more popular in certain countries than other countries.
Yeah. Right. So see you all in future events. Again, thank you very much, Josh. Thanks to everyone. And we make sure to check the Ayn Rand Center UK, the YouTube channel where you can see previous appearances by Josh, and see you all in our future events. I think Monday the event is Atlas Shrugging, and then again Wednesday and next Saturday. Thanks everyone, and have a good evening.